Well, earlier you mentioned this question of escapism, and you've alluded to it multiple times now by saying that there are even some Orthodox Christians who say, look, this is not appropriate for us to read. This is bad. This is sinful. Like, for instance, every so often you hear even just Christians in general will say, especially about like Harry Potter, right? Like it's teaching kids witchcraft, And they'll say the same kinds of things about Tolkien as well. And just as an anecdote, I actually once met a monk, and honestly, I don't think he's a monk now. I can't remember where he ended up. But anyway, I met a monk who, he's at least not at that monastery anymore, that I know, who he actually said that fiction was sinful, and he identified it with the fantasia that is warned against by the Holy Fathers. Right. And I just sort of listened to him say this. I figured, okay, I'm not going to argue with a monk. But I remember hearing that and just thinking, oh, man, this is bad. And the context was that his monastery was actually putting together a homeschooling curriculum, interestingly enough. This was years and years ago. And I just asked, like, well, what kind of literature are you having them read or whatever? And he essentially said, we don't do that. Because fiction is false. It's it leads us away from God, and so talk about that a little bit. Let's hone in on this particular question.
Yeah, well, I hear it a lot, and it's really, really unfortunate. You and Steve started to talk about it a little bit in the first podcast when you were mentioning the sort of flat version of the universe and how people are unable to see sort of beneath it or seeing transcendence pierce through it. And you weren't talking about Christians, I don't think you were talking about non-Christians. But the problem here is that this sort of outlook presupposes a certain formation in the spiritual life that may have never happened in a human being. So if a monk is saying, I don't need to read literature, and he is already at the point of his prayer where he has tears, where he is genuinely receiving gifts of the Holy Spirit, like some of the saints, of course he's probably not going to be reading fiction, because more likely than not, it is at the very least not useful for him, because he's at the point where he can at least nominally pray without ceasing. Whether or not that prayer is already the prayer of the heart is a different story. But how do we get to that point? That's that point of spiritual development. We have to cultivate our imagination, because we are created as creatures who tell stories. This is inherent to us. And again, I think the point of Christ being a storyteller himself is not just something that you can say, well, so what? Because if it wasn't important, then he wouldn't tell so many parables. I think it's very intrinsic to his ministry. And he said that he who has eyes to see, let him see. Meaning there is something more here than what I am telling you. Meaning there is something deeper in this story than what I'm telling you. Meaning the story itself as a medium is something that can give deep truths. So we have to be formed intellectually, physically, in our souls before we can become formed spiritually, or simultaneously, right? We are creatures not of spirit only. We're not angels. If we were angels, then we could say, don't eat, don't have children, don't do anything that gives you fleshly pleasures, not in a bad sense, but like, sleeping in or reading a pleasant book. Don't do any of that, because that's not important. We are creatures. We're not creatures of spirit though, right? We are creatures of soul, body, and spirit. And each one of those parts is not insignificant. It's not like we were created as souls that were then imprisoned in bodies. That's a Gnostic way of looking at the world. And unfortunately, that Gnosticism sometimes comes out in Orthodox theology, not Orthodox theology, but in theologians who consider themselves to be Orthodox. It was a problem in the early church, and it continues to be a problem in our own time. And this sort of approach to sort of excessive spiritualization is harmful, because how many people do you know, Father? How many children do you know that can be raised to become saints if they are not first given the kind of intellectual and spiritual food that literature provides. Because what does literature do? Literature makes us empathetic. It helps us to see the world through the point of view of somebody else. And unfortunately, we are so fallen, we are so absorbed in our own existences, we are so wrapped up in our own minds, and now increasingly we are so distracted by gadgets that take us away from the experience of ourselves and experiences of other people, of being actually in the presence, in the communion of another person, that literature is indispensable. Because if our children are the most anxious that people have been in the history of man, which some people are actually saying, some scientists are making the assertion that this coming generation of high school students are more anxious than ever in the history of recording things like anxiety, it's because they don't have the capacity to empathize. They don't know how to see themselves in the shoes of another person. But literature does that, because you are forced, through the experience of reading through the perspective of another person, you're forced to see and experience the life of someone else. And there's actually, again, like I said, I don't like to harp on scientific research and all this, but in cases where scientific research merely confirms a truth, it's useful to mention that the fact that there are, brain scanning studies that show that the effects of reading fiction are seen in the brain, in the chemistry of the brain, as lingering 5 to 7 days after finishing reading. So if you are reading, yes, no joke. So if you are reading something like The Lord of the Rings, which is completely imbued with a Christian worldview, then you absorb that worldview in a way that is so profound that it sticks with you for days at an end. And you are able to see the world through other people's eyes. You're able to see a human being in the other person across from you. That's not possible anymore if you simply try to raise yourself on, a strict regimen of prayer and going to church. This is unfortunately the reality of living in the world. I'm not talking about monasticism. I'm not talking about certain people who may have a special calling, somebody like Saint Porphyrius, who went to Mount Athos when he was 13. I doubt that he needed to read fiction to become a saint, but those people are very rare. And those people, and although we are called to be saints, we are called to be saints through the gifts that are given to us and through the things that God gives us. And this sort of a worldview that says that fiction or the arts are unnecessary, it's agnostic worldview essentially, because it forgets the fact that Christ came and redeemed not simply man, but the whole world. In fact, the whole cosmos, right? Not just Earth, but the whole cosmos was redeemed by his incarnation. And this is absolutely integral to our theology. It's why we have icons. It's why we don't consider, bowing down and venerating a piece of wood with, paint on it to be idolatry. It's not, because we are using the sanctified matter to point to a higher reality. Because our world is a world of many realities. And if you forget that, then you live on a flat earth, even if you're a monk, unfortunately. And no, I don't want to say anything against monasticism or against monks. I live next to a monastery, and I try to read as much ascetic literature as I can, because we are creatures of ascesis. We can only become saved that way. But we have to be formed. Our imagination has to be formed before we can dedicate it to God. How can we pray if our mind doesn't know how to think properly? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had, by contrast, I had another monk who said to me, what are you reading? And I told him some theological book at the time or whatever. He said, make sure you read fiction before you go to bed.
There you go.
And I was like, really? He said, yes. I'm reading Dickens. I'm rereading Dickens now, actually. Yeah, I was like, oh, that's good. So but even if you read, like, for instance, I've been reading a little bit lately from Saint Paisius, the relatively newly glorified saint, and he tells stories, like he tells little parables and stuff like that. In the course of what it is that he's doing. So he's engaging in this sub-creative act, right? And it occurs to me, like you mentioned iconography, for instance, and it occurs to me like that if someone might justify iconography by saying, well, the icons just simply show the thing that really is. There's nothing sort of fictive about it, right? It's not imaginative, But the thing that I would say is, well, okay, then why is it that now that we have the ability to photograph people,
Yeah.
Why do we still paint icons of modern saints and not just simply put photographs on the wall? Because the photograph is the truest, right? You know, in terms of if we're just trying to make a record of what's sort of quote unquote real, then that's what we should be hanging on our iconostases of saints who lived at a time when we have photographs.
Yes,
you know? But we don't do that. We instead engage in sub-creative acts where we depict them in color, and maybe we'll change their clothes. Yeah. Maybe we'll, there's all kinds of things that happen that are sub-creative acts that are still within the tradition of iconography and still saying something true, but are not a record simply of the thing that happened,